The weather is heating up. It's nice to be outside. You hear the birds tweeting. You see the squirrels running around. And you also have a neighbor who's arguing with you over your property line, claiming that you have unlawfully possessed some of their property. What do you do? All right, in today's video, we're going to be talking about property disputes with neighbors. And this is going to start a series of videos about neighbor disputes because they're very, very common. I mean, if you live in a house or an apartment or a townhouse or a condo, you have neighbors. Just about all of us have neighbors, and not every neighbor relationship is positive. And unfortunately, you end up in situations where you could be fighting with your neighbors for years, making it very difficult and uncomfortable to enjoy living in your house or being out in your back or front yard. So we're going to talk today about property disputes and how to deal with them. First, you have to understand where property disputes come from. And more often than not, it comes from a lack of understanding by one property owner over the legal description or boundaries of their property. For example, you might purchase a home and you might believe that a particular area of land where, let's say, there's shrubbery or trees is yours. But you didn't look at any of the legal documents during the course of your closing. You just assumed, because looking at the property from a visual inspection, it appears that the lot where your property is has those shrubs and trees on it. But if you had looked at some of the legal documents that were part of your closing, maybe you would have seen that a section or all of that area of shrubs might not actually be on your property. Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about irregular lots. I'm talking about areas and parcels of land that might be small, that would appear from the naked eye to be on one particular property, but in fact are not. So when I say looking at the documents in your closing, what am I talking about? Well, I'm primarily talking about surveys. Surveys are one of the most important aspects of a property, especially when you are closing on a property, meaning purchasing a property. You need to pay close attention to the property lines and boundaries that are on the survey. Now, let's assume you're buying a house. I always tell my clients to make sure that you have an updated survey. And oftentimes clients are resistant. They might say, I don't want to spend money on a survey. The prior owners have a survey. And that survey could be 10, 15 years old. Does that mean that things have changed over the course of 10 to 15 years? Do property lines morph on their own? Of course not. But you don't know what occurred during those 10 to 15 years. You don't know if there was a disputed area of land that the neighbors worked out. Maybe one neighbor purchased a small piece of the land from the other neighbor. You have no idea. So relying on an old survey is really not advisable. It doesn't cost all that much money to have a new survey done, a meets and bounds survey, where a surveyor will come out and essentially stake the land and determine what areas of that property are yours. It's maybe $300 to $500 at maximum, depending upon where you live. But that money saves you so much aggravation when you're dealing with a neighbor dispute, so much money if you have to, as a last resort, end up in litigation. It's worth it. You know, the way that a lot of these neighborhoods are laid out, especially here in New Jersey, they are World War II era, building structures or World War II era layouts. And oftentimes there are irregular lots. It's not uncommon for an entire block to contain irregular lots, meaning that they're not that perfect rectangle or square that you would think they would be. Now, that brings me to dealing with these disputes. Let me start by saying this. Let me tell you that filing a lawsuit when it comes to neighbor disputes should be your ultimate last resort. It is not the first choice of action when you're dealing with issues with your neighbor. Why? Why wouldn't you just go out and file a lawsuit? Claim what's rightfully yours. Well, because you have to live next door to that person. And I don't know, and neither do you, how long you are going to be living next door to that person. Could it be 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? Think about the relationship that you are going to have with your neighbor if you immediately launch into aggressive litigation. You're going to have a horrible relationship. Oftentimes, and I see it a lot, when that's the first approach to dealing with a property dispute, it sets the tone, and throughout the course of your neighbor relationship, every time your kid hits a wiffle ball on their property, the next door neighbor will throw it away or complain about your kids trespassing on their lawn. Every chance they get, they'll be complaining about something you're doing. They'll be calling the police because you've got music that's too loud on a Saturday afternoon, or whatever other issue that they can come up with, even if it's not completely valid. This is what you create when you immediately launch into a lawsuit. So how should you deal with property disputes? Well, they oftentimes start with your neighbor, or maybe it's yourself, complaining that the adjoining property is somehow infringing upon your property line. It could be a fence, it could be trees or shrubs, it could be an expansion of their building or steps, it could be a whole host of things. But regardless of what the issue is, the first thing you should do is go back and review your property survey. Make sure before you start a big issue that you are correct in the area of dispute, that it's actually yours. If you don't have a survey, it's well worth the $300 or so to get someone to come out and to redo the survey for you. You're going to need that anyway. I mean, if the last resort happens and you are forced to file a lawsuit, you are going to need a survey to prove what area of the property is yours. So there's no harm in getting it first. That is the first step that you should undertake. Get your survey, understand what is your property, because maybe your perceived dispute isn't even valid. After you have reviewed your survey, and let's say that your neighbor is in the wrong and they are encroaching on your property. Let's say that they placed a fence and it's on your property line by a foot or a few inches or whatever the distance or measurements are. The next step is to openly communicate with your neighbor. That doesn't mean send a threatening letter, if you don't remove your fence, I'm going to sue you. What it means is that you should try to resolve the dispute amicably by first communicating with your neighbor. Show your neighbor the survey. You know, it's possible that your neighbor didn't do it on purpose. Maybe your neighbor didn't realize. Maybe they didn't check their survey. Or maybe the fence company or the landscaper who planted the shrubs or whatever it is, maybe they didn't understand where they were supposed to put the fence or the shrubs. Once you've done that, you move on to the next step, which is trying to find an amicable resolution to the issue. Now let's assume that they placed a fence on your property and it's significantly on your property, a foot or more. The only solution in that situation might be for you to request that your neighbor remove the fence and place it properly on their property line. Now, they may be agreeable to do that, they may be resistant. The issue really is between them and the company that put the fence down. And so maybe it was the fence company who made it a mistake, maybe it was the neighbor. But your first option here as a solution is to request that they remove the fence and place it properly. Now, if they're encroaching on your property by, let's say, a nominal amount, an inch, a half an inch, a quarter of an inch, you might want to have an agreement signed with them, basically saying that you are allowing them to keep that fence on your 1 inch of property, but that in no way does that create an adverse possession issue. So in other words, you're protecting and preserving your rights to your property line, but you're giving them essentially an easement to use that 1 inch of space where their fence is. Because maybe that 1 inch isn't that important to you in the grand scheme of things. Maybe it's not worth that fight that you might have by forcing them to move the fence back an inch. It's a different story if the fence is a foot or more over your property. That's a significant encroachment. And in instances like that, of course, the solution or the suggested solution should be to have the neighbor move the fence back. The bottom line is that communicating with your neighbor in an effective way is oftentimes the best way to resolve a property line dispute. Again, they don't always do it on purpose. They're not necessarily trying to steal your land. They just might not know. And by bringing a survey to them and in a non-accusatory way, discussing the fact that they're on your property and seeking resolution, even if that means the neighbor removing the fence because they've encroached so much, or you agreeing to that small easement, that could resolve the issue completely, and that preserves the relationship that you have with your neighbor. What if you get to a point where you've done that and your neighbor is unwilling to, let's say, remove that fence that's a foot on your property? Then you could suggest to your neighbor, hey, listen, I know that we're not able to work this out. Maybe we should contact a mediator and see if the mediator can help us resolve this issue. That oftentimes can solve the problem, especially when, let's say, your neighbor and you are relatively in agreement, but your spouses are not. That happens all the time. So let's say your neighbor, who's placed that fence a foot under your property, understands your position, understands your survey, and is willing to move the fence back. However, his spouse is not. He or she says, I don't know, that's our property. That's the way I don't care what the survey says. I asked, I went to the town, I talked to the landscaper, I talked to the fence company, and that spouse is unwilling. Well, in instances like that, you might be able to suggest that all parties go before a neutral third-party mediator and try to resolve the issue. It's going to save time and money. Going to mediation is cost-effective and certainly less time-consuming and aggressive than a lawsuit. So that would be the next step. So let's review the progression. First is, once you identify the encroachment, you need to consult and or have a survey done, and you need to understand what your property lines are. The next step is to communicate directly with your neighbor and try to seek resolution on your own. If you can't seek resolution, then propose mediation with all parties to try to resolve it. If all else fails, you might be left with the only option being to file a lawsuit. Filing a lawsuit is, again, last resort territory because it's going to impact in a negative way, if not destroy, the relationship that you have with your neighbor. Once you file a lawsuit, things are not going to be the same. You are going to be resentful, they are going to be resentful, you're going to be forced to live next to this person, and it's not going to be pleasant. It's not going to be pleasant for you, your dogs, your cats, your kids. It's just going to be awful. And oftentimes people end up moving because they've had such a horrible dispute with their neighbor. And you know, when you talk about lawsuits in general, I don't think people realize how contentious, aggressive, argumentative, and awful they can be. You might say to yourself, I'm just going to file a lawsuit. Let's let the judge decide this. We can't really agree. They don't want to go to mediation. It'll be fine. It's not going to be fine. Your neighbor is not going to take kindly to being sued. And your neighbor is likely, if he gets a lawyer, or even if he doesn't, going to say things about you that you don't like. I don't care what you think. 9 times out of 10, litigation is going to result in hard feelings. Last resort territory, you have to file a lawsuit and you're asking the court to determine the property lines. Now I'll give you a real world example. I had a case like that where there was ownership issues over a particular parcel of land. And in this case, it was an access road that led down to these other properties. And my client lived third house in down this access road. And the first house tried to prevent certain activities from being done on the street. Kids playing on this access road, cars being parked. And it was a mistaken belief that that property owner, that first house, owned that roadway. And in fact, they did not. Now, in that case, we employed all of these techniques that I'm talking to you about today. First, we pulled all of the town records to determine who owned that roadway. And it was a very complicated situation because it turns out that the original developers owned that roadway. And the original developers were long deceased. So nobody actually owned that roadway. So after we did that, then my clients went to talk to the neighbors. That didn't work. Then we tried to mediate with the neighbors. And unfortunately, the scenario that I talked about earlier, where the neighbor and the neighbor's spouse were at odds, played out. And nobody would agree to mediate the situation. So ultimately, the only choice that my client had was to file a lawsuit and ask the court for a declaration that that first house, that first property owner did not own that roadway. And that lawsuit went on for almost 1.5 years. It was time-consuming and expensive, but in that case, it was necessary. But that case that I'm explaining to you now should be viewed as a unique situation. It should not be your go-to solution for dealing with your neighbors. Getting upset, getting emotional, ranting and raving, it's not going to help things. You need to be level-headed. I understand it's your house, it's your property. I understand that, you're trying to preserve your quality of life. But if you are trying to do those things, the last thing you want to do is start a war with your neighbor. While, yes, there are times when the only thing you can do is file a lawsuit, that is not the first thing you should do. I want you to remember the steps that we talked about today and employ them if you find yourself in a situation where you've got a dispute over a property line with your neighbor. Well, I hope that helps resolve your neighbor disputes, or at least gives you some tools to use to try to resolve these property line disputes before you end up in litigation.